Detroit, Michigan, August 1975. The spotlight swept across the front row of the Cobo Arena, catching the faces of screaming fans, excited teenagers, middle-aged couples reliving their youth. But one face stood out to the band members who had a clear view from the stage. A 14-year-old boy in the second row who wasn't screaming or smiling. He was crying. Not the happy tears of an excited fan, but deep, body-shaking sobs that he was trying desperately to hide by covering his face with his hands. Elvis noticed him during the third song, Love Me Tender, and couldn't look away. The boy was clutching something against his chest, rocking slightly back and forth, and every time Elvis's voice filled the arena, the boy cried harder. During the instrumental break, Elvis leaned over to his security chief standing in the wings and pointed to the boy. "Find out what's wrong," Elvis said, his voice tight with concern. "Something's not right." What security discovered during intermission would break Elvis's heart and lead to one of the most powerful moments in his entire performing career. A moment when the king of rock and roll claimed a lost boy as his own in front of 25,000 witnesses. If you want to discover how one foster child's confession changed Elvis Presley forever and led to an adoption that would inspire thousands of families, please subscribe to our channel. This is the story nobody talks about when they discuss Elvis's legacy. David Patterson's life had been defined by impermanence. At 4 years old, he entered the foster care system after his mother died of a drug overdose, and his father, who had never been part of his life, couldn't be located. From that moment forward, David lived in a world where nothing lasted, where every connection was temporary, where home was just a word for the place you slept until someone decided you needed to go somewhere else. By the time he was 14, David had lived in 12 different foster homes across Michigan. Some had been decent, run by people who genuinely tried to care for the rotating cast of children passing through their doors. Others had been nightmares, places where David was just a check from the state, where he was fed and housed but never loved, never truly seen as a child who needed more than basic survival. David had learned early not to get attached to anything or anyone. Foster siblings came and went. Foster parents would promise he could stay and then change their minds when a younger, cuter child became available for placement. Teachers at school would just start to learn his name, and then he would be transferred to a different district when he moved homes. The only constant in David's chaotic life was music, specifically Elvis Presley. His biological mother, during the brief years David could remember her, had loved Elvis. She had played his records constantly, and some of David's only memories of her involved Elvis's voice filling their small apartment. After she died, Elvis's music became David's connection to her, the only thing that remained from that earlier life before everything fell apart. Every time David moved to a new foster home, he carried the same worn Elvis poster and his transistor radio. The poster would go up on whatever wall he was assigned, in whatever bedroom he temporarily occupied, and he would fall asleep every night listening to Elvis stations, letting that familiar voice be the last thing he heard before sleep. Elvis represented everything David longed for: consistency, reliability, someone who was always there when you needed them. Unlike foster parents who would eventually send him away, unlike social workers who rotated cases, unlike everyone else in David's life, Elvis was constant. His voice never changed. His presence through the radio was dependable. In a strange way that David couldn't quite articulate, Elvis had become the closest thing to a father figure that David had ever known. When Mrs. Henderson, David's current foster mother, told him she had gotten a ticket to see Elvis perform in Detroit, David thought it was a cruel joke. Mrs. Henderson was one of the better foster parents David had experienced. She was kind. She tried to make him feel included with her biological children. She noticed when he was sad, even though he tried to hide it. But an Elvis concert ticket? That seemed too good to be true, too generous for a foster kid who had learned to expect disappointment. But Mrs. Henderson was serious. She had won the ticket in a radio contest and thought David should have it, since she knew how much Elvis meant to him. She would drive him to Detroit, drop him off, and pick him up after the show. David could barely process it. He was actually going to see Elvis Presley in person, the man who had been his only constant, the voice that had gotten him through the worst nights in the worst homes. The night of the concert, David dressed in his best clothes, which weren't very impressive, faded jeans and a t-shirt that was slightly too small. He combed his hair carefully, wanting to look presentable, wanting to somehow be worthy of being in the same room as Elvis. During the drive to Detroit, he was quiet, lost in thoughts about what this night might mean. He had imagined this moment so many times, pictured himself in a crowd of Elvis fans, getting to experience live what he had only experienced through speakers and vinyl records. He never imagined Elvis would notice him. He never imagined this night would change his life. When the lights went down and Elvis took the stage, David felt something break open inside his chest. There he was, the man whose voice David had fallen asleep to hundreds of times, whose posters David had carried from home to home like sacred relics, whose music had been David's only reliable companion through a childhood of constant displacement. Elvis was real, he was right there, and David couldn't control the emotions flooding through him. Every song hit differently when you could see Elvis's face, see the way he moved, feel the vibrations from the speakers. When Elvis sang "Love Me Tender," David thought about how nobody had ever loved him tenderly, how he had spent 10 years being tolerated but never treasured. The tears started then, and David couldn't stop them. He tried to hide his face, embarrassed by his inability to control himself, but the grief and longing were too powerful to contain. Jerry Williams had been Elvis's security chief for 3 years and had seen thousands of crying fans. But something about the boy in the second row felt different. This wasn't hysteria or excitement. This was pain. When Elvis asked him to check on the boy during intermission, Jerry approached carefully, not wanting to embarrass the kid or make the situation worse. He knelt down beside David's seat and spoke gently. "Hey there, you okay? Elvis noticed you were upset and wanted to make sure you're not hurt or anything." David looked up, his face wet with tears, shocked that Elvis had noticed him at all. "I'm fine," he said automatically, the response every foster kid learns. Never admit something's wrong, never draw attention, never be a problem. But Jerry didn't leave. He had kids of his own, and something about this boy's face told him there was a real story here. "You don't look fine, son, and it's okay not to be fine. Sometimes these concerts bring up big feelings, but Elvis really is concerned. He's not going to come back out for the second half until I tell him you're okay. So why don't you help me out and tell me what's going on?" The fact that Elvis cared enough to delay the show broke something in David's carefully constructed defenses. In a rush of words, trying to explain before he lost his courage, David told Jerry everything. About foster care, about 12 homes in 10 years, about using Elvis's music to feel less alone, about how Elvis's voice was the only thing that had traveled with him through every placement. And then David said the thing that would change everything. "Elvis is the only father I've ever had. I know that sounds stupid because he doesn't even know I exist, but his music raised me more than any adult ever did." Jerry Williams, a tough man who had worked security in rough situations, felt his eyes getting wet. He put a hand on David's shoulder and said, "That doesn't sound stupid at all, kid. And you're wrong about one thing. Elvis does know you exist now. Wait right here." Jerry went straight to Elvis's dressing room, knowing that what he was about to share would hit Elvis hard. Elvis had a well-known soft spot for kids, especially kids who were struggling, and this story was going to devastate him. When Jerry repeated David's words, the dressing room went silent. Elvis stood up, his face showing a series of emotions: shock, sadness, determination. "Bring him backstage," Elvis said quietly. "Right now. I need to talk to him before I go back out there." David thought Jerry was joking when he said Elvis wanted to meet him. Foster kids don't get to meet their heroes. Foster kids get disappointment and broken promises and adults who don't follow through. But Jerry was serious, leading David through security checkpoints and down corridors David had only imagined, until they reached a door with Elvis's name on it. Jerry knocked, opened the door, and gently pushed David inside. Elvis Presley was standing in the middle of the room, and when he saw David, he crossed the space in 3 strides and did something David never expected. He hugged him, Not a brief, polite hug, but a real embrace. The kind of hug a father gives a son, strong and protective and lasting long enough that David's carefully maintained composure shattered completely. Elvis held this crying 14-year-old boy he had never met before and let him sob into his jeweled jumpsuit. When David finally pulled back, embarrassed and apologizing, Elvis kept his hands on David's shoulders and looked directly into his eyes. "Don't apologize for crying, son. Never apologize for that. Jerry told me about your situation, about foster care, about moving around, about listening to my music in all those different places." Elvis's voice was gentle but thick with emotion. "And he told me what you said, about me being like a father to you. David, that's about the most important thing anyone has ever said to me. More important than any award or hit record. You know why?" David shook his head, unable to speak. "Because every kid deserves a father. Every kid deserves someone who's there for them, who's constant, who loves them no matter what. And if my music gave you even a little bit of that feeling, then that's the best thing I've ever done with my career." Elvis pulled David to sit down on the couch and spent the next 15 minutes asking about his life. What were the foster homes like? What did David want to do when he grew up? What was his favorite song? Did he have any brothers or sisters, even foster siblings he missed? Elvis listened intently, asking follow-up questions, treating David's answers like they mattered. For David, who spent most of his life feeling invisible, this attention from someone famous, someone important, was almost overwhelming. But Elvis wasn't done. He asked David about his current foster placement, whether Mrs. Henderson was kind to him, whether he felt safe. David admitted that Mrs. Henderson was nice, one of the better homes, but that he knew it was temporary like all the others. He never felt like he truly belonged anywhere. Elvis went quiet for a moment, thinking, and then made a decision that would change David's life trajectory forever. When Elvis walked back on stage for the second half of the concert, David was beside him. The crowd, expecting Elvis to launch into his next song, instead went silent in confusion as they saw the nervous teenager in street clothes standing next to the king of rock and roll. Elvis walked to center stage, put his arm around David's shoulders, and grabbed the microphone. His voice, usually full of showman's energy, was quiet and sincere. "I want to introduce you all to someone very special. This is David. David is 14 years old, and he's been in foster care since he was 4 years old. He's lived in 12 different homes." The arena was completely silent now, 25,000 people sensing that something important was happening. During intermission, David told my security chief something that I can't get out of my head. He said that I was like a father to him, that my music has been the only constant in his life as he's moved from place to place, home to home. Elvis paused, his voice breaking slightly. "Now, I don't know about all of you, but I think that's just about the saddest and most beautiful thing I've ever heard. Sad because no child should have to go through what David has been through. Beautiful because it means music can be family, music can be home, music can be love when there's nowhere else to find it." Elvis looked down at David, who was trembling beside him, overwhelmed by the attention of thousands of people. "David, I want you to know something, and I want all these people here to be witnesses." Elvis's voice grew stronger, more certain. "From this moment on, you're not alone anymore. You hear me? You are not alone." Then Elvis said the words that would make headlines across America the next day. "David, I'm claiming you as my son, right here, right now, in front of all these people. Anyone here want to argue with me about that?" The arena erupted. 25,000 people on their feet, screaming, crying, applauding. David stood frozen in shock, unable to process what had just happened. Elvis had just claimed him as a son in front of all these witnesses. The king of rock and roll, the man whose music had been David's only constant, had just publicly declared that David belonged to him. Elvis pulled David into another hug, and this time David hugged back with everything he had. 10 years of longing for exactly this kind of moment pouring out of him. Elvis let him cry, let the audience applaud, let the moment breathe until David was ready. Then Elvis turned back to the microphone, still holding David close. we're going to take care of you now, son. That's a promise, and I don't break my promises." The crowd's approval was deafening. What happened on stage was emotionally powerful, but Elvis understood that emotions weren't enough. David needed practical help, legal protection, actual change in his circumstances. Immediately after the concert, Elvis met with his personal lawyer and began the process of becoming David's legal guardian. The foster care system, shocked and somewhat overwhelmed by the sudden involvement of one of the world's most famous entertainers, cooperated quickly. Background checks were expedited, home studies were conducted, and within weeks, the legal paperwork was in motion. Mrs. Henderson, David's current foster mother, was supportive and understanding, recognizing that this was an incredible opportunity for a boy who deserved something good in his life. She helped facilitate the transition, making sure David felt supported through the process. Elvis arranged for David to move to Memphis, to live at Graceland when Elvis was in town, and with Elvis's trusted friends in the Memphis area when Elvis was touring. He enrolled David in a good private school, made sure he had therapy to work through the trauma of his childhood, and most importantly, made sure David knew he was wanted, that this wasn't temporary, that he had finally found a permanent home. Elvis introduced David to his daughter Lisa Marie, who was 7 years old at the time, telling Lisa that David was her new brother. He bought David clothes, helped him with homework when he was home, taught him to play guitar, included him in family dinners and holidays. Elvis treated David like what he had claimed him as, a son. But Elvis also understood that one family adopting one child, while meaningful for that child, didn't solve the broader problem. He used the publicity from David's story to advocate for foster care reform, to encourage other families to consider adoption, to raise money for organizations supporting children in the system. He talked in interviews about David, about the 300,000 kids in foster care who needed families, about the importance of providing not just physical care but love and belonging. Elvis established a fund to support foster care and adoption services, donating significant money and using his influence to raise awareness. David's story became a catalyst for broader conversations about the foster care system and what society owed to its most vulnerable children. The transition wasn't always easy. David had spent 10 years in survival mode, never trusting that good things would last, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. He tested boundaries, pushed back against rules, struggled to believe that Elvis's commitment was real. There were hard days, therapy sessions where David had to confront his trauma, moments when he felt like he didn't deserve the good things happening to him. But Elvis was patient. He had dealt with his own demons, his own struggles, and he understood that healing wasn't linear. He showed up consistently, proved through actions, not just words, that David could rely on him, that this wasn't going to end the way everything else in David's life had ended. Slowly, over months and then years, David began to believe it. He began to settle into life at Graceland, to make friends at his new school, to think about a future that extended beyond survival to actual dreams and goals. He wanted to become a social worker, to help other kids in foster care, to give back some of what had been given to him. Elvis supported that goal, talking with David about education and career paths, promising to help pay for college, encouraging him to pursue meaningful work. David started calling Elvis Dad, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence as it became clear Elvis wasn't going anywhere. And Elvis lit up every time he heard it, proud to be David's father, grateful for the opportunity to make a real difference in one young person's life. The relationship between Elvis and David became one of the most important in Elvis's final years. As Elvis struggled with his own health issues and personal demons, David was there, a reminder of why life mattered, why showing up mattered, why fighting to be better mattered. David needed Elvis, but in many ways, Elvis needed David too. They gave each other purpose, connection, love that transcended biology and fame, and all the complications that defined both their lives. When people asked Elvis about David, about why he had done what he did that night in Detroit, Elvis's answer was always simple: because every kid deserves a father, and I was in a position to be that for David. How could I not? David's story inspired thousands of families to consider foster care and adoption. In the months following the Detroit concert, adoption agencies across America reported significant increases in inquiries, many specifically citing David's story as their motivation. Elvis's public advocacy kept the conversation going, keeping foster care in the national consciousness in a way it rarely had been before. Other celebrities began following Elvis's lead, either adopting from foster care themselves or using their platforms to advocate for system reform. The cultural conversation around foster care shifted slightly, moving from seeing it as purely a government welfare program to understanding it as a collective responsibility, a way for families to directly impact children's lives. For the foster care community itself, David's story provided something crucial: hope. Kids in the system saw that David had found a family, that he had gone from feeling invisible to being claimed publicly by one of the most famous people in the world. It didn't solve their individual situations, but it gave them permission to dream, to believe that they too deserved love and belonging, to understand that their circumstances didn't define their worth. Foster parents and social workers felt seen and validated, their difficult work acknowledged on a national stage. The story created space for more honest conversations about what kids in foster care need and what society could do better. When Elvis died in 1977, just 2 years after meeting David, the coverage of his death mentioned not just his music, but his generosity, his compassion, and specifically his relationship with David. David, then 16, spoke at Elvis's funeral about what Elvis had meant to him, about how Elvis had saved his life by giving him a family and a future. The grief was real and deep, but so was the gratitude. Elvis had kept his promise. He had been there for David, had provided stability and love, had changed David's trajectory from one of survival to one of possibility. In 2 years, Elvis had given David what 10 years in foster care hadn't: a sense of belonging, of being wanted, of having a place in the world. David went on to graduate from college with a degree in social work, exactly as he had planned. He spent his career working in foster care and adoption services, specifically focusing on finding permanent homes for older children and teens who were often overlooked by prospective adoptive parents. He married, had children of his own, and made sure they understood the story of their grandfather Elvis and how one moment of compassion had changed everything. David established the Elvis Presley Foster Care Foundation, using Elvis's legacy and name to raise money and awareness for foster care reform. He became a national advocate, testifying before Congress, consulting with child welfare agencies, training foster parents, always telling his story as an example of what was possible when someone chose to see a child in crisis and respond with love. In interviews later in life, David would reflect on that night in Detroit as the moment his life split into before and after. Before, he was invisible, temporary, a kid passing through systems and homes with no real place to land. After, he was David Patterson Presley, claimed son of the king, someone who mattered, someone who belonged. He never took for granted what Elvis had given him. He spent his life trying to create similar moments for other foster kids, trying to replicate the magic of being seen, being chosen, being loved. And while not every foster kid could be adopted by Elvis Presley, David's work helped ensure that more kids found permanent families, stable homes, and the knowledge that they were worthy of love. The story of Elvis and David reminds us that family is built, not just born. It shows us that the most meaningful legacies aren't always the ones we plan, but the ones that come from responding to need with generosity, from using power and privilege to lift up those without either. Elvis had countless opportunities to ignore David, to let security handle the crying kid in the second row, to enjoy his concert without getting involved in a complicated foster care situation. But Elvis chose differently. He stopped the show, he asked questions, he listened, and he acted. That choice didn't just change David's life. It demonstrated for millions of people what responsible celebrity looks like, what it means to use a platform for more than self-promotion, what authentic compassion requires. For the foster care community, Elvis's story with David remains a touchstone, referenced in training materials and advocacy campaigns decades later. It represents both the acute need within the system, hundreds of thousands of kids like David waiting for someone to claim them, and the potential for transformation when adults step up. Every child in foster care deserves what David got, not necessarily fame or wealth, but belonging, consistency, love that doesn't end when things get hard. Elvis gave David that gift, and in doing so, challenged all of us to consider what we might give to children who need families. The night Elvis claimed David as his son in front of 25,000 witnesses wasn't just a feel-good moment. It was a declaration of values, a public commitment to prioritizing vulnerable children, a challenge to a society that too often forgets the kids in its foster care system. Elvis backed up that moment with action, with legal process, with daily presence in David's life. He proved that adoption isn't about saving children, but about recognizing that family is something we create through choice and commitment. And David proved that kids in foster care aren't broken or damaged, but resilient and worthy, capable of thriving when given the opportunity. Together, they showed America what was possible. That legacy lives on in every child who finds a permanent family, in every adult who chooses to open their home, in every moment when someone sees a kid in crisis and decides to respond with love instead of looking away.